Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a text that honestly, most people completely skip over. Imagine sitting down to read the Gospel of Matthew. You flip past the title page, you're getting ready for these thrilling biographies, miracles, and profound parables, and suddenly, boom, you hit a wall. The very first page reads like an ancient phone book. It's just this endless, exhausting list of hard-to-pronounce names and begats. For a modern reader, it is incredibly tempting to just gloss right over it. But for a first-century reader, this wasn't a boring preamble. It was actually the most explosive proof in the entire text. What if I told you that this seemingly tedious list is actually a fascinating, brilliantly woven literary master plan?
So think about it. Why on earth would you open a book with 42 generations? It's a pretty bold move to make your audience wade through a massive family tree before the story even begins. But here is the real mind-bending mystery we're unpacking today. The Bible actually contains two completely different family trees for Jesus. You've got one in the Gospel of Matthew and another one in the Gospel of Luke. And at first glance, if you read them side by side, they seem to completely contradict each other. They have different lengths, different names, and they run in completely different directions. Well, we're going to figure out exactly why.
All right, Section 1, the hidden master plan.
Okay, let's dive into this. These lists, they're not just dry historical records. They are carefully constructed theological and legal documents, designed to prove a massive point. When you understand how they're built, you stop seeing a tedious registry and you start seeing a blueprint of ancient literature, ordered name by name, from the very first human in a garden all the way down to a carpenter in Nazareth. Now, Matthew's account goes downwards. He starts with Abraham and walks us down this grand royal staircase through a lineage of powerful kings. The writer Luke, on the flip side, does the exact opposite. He starts with Jesus and climbs upward, ascending through the roots of humanity, passing right through unknown commoners all the way up to Adam. Two different directions, two different sets of names.
Moving right along to Section 2, from dust to the patriarchs.
To really make sense of the end, we've got to start at the absolute beginning. Let's trace the deep chronology of this family tree and see how the ancient text establishes its major themes right out of the gate. The text points us back to Adam. According to the Genesis narrative, he's the first human, formed from the dust. And it is no coincidence that his name in Hebrew, Adam, comes from the word Adamah, which literally translates to earth or soil. The original text is using this beautiful poetic wordplay to tell us that the first man carries the name of the clay he was formed from. It firmly roots this entire cosmic story and this massive genealogy in the literal dirt. The master plan literally starts from scratch.
Right away, we encounter our first major rule-breaker pattern. In ancient times, the strong, famous firstborn son was supposed to inherit absolutely everything. That was just how the world worked. But the text intentionally bypasses firstborns like Cain and Ishmael. Think about the cultural shock of bypassing Esau, the strong, obvious choice, for Jacob, the younger trickster twin. The promise passes through Seth, the son born after a massive family tragedy. Then Isaac, born when it was humanly impossible for his parents to conceive. Then Jacob. The text is establishing early on that this lineage doesn't follow expected human rules. God's master plan consistently chooses the unexpected.
As we move through the early generations, the Genesis record repeats a pretty depressing rhythm. It beats like a solemn drum. And he died, and he died, and he died. But then we hit a man named Enoch, and the text completely shatters the pattern. The record suddenly says, he walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. Enoch is the only one in that early pre-flood list who doesn't die. He provides this sudden, breathtaking moment of hope in what is otherwise a literal litany of tombs.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is if you actually do the hidden math here, something incredible emerges. Enoch's son was Methuselah, famously recorded as living 969 years. Just think about the sheer exhaustion of living for nearly a millennium. But if you take out a calculator and add up the timeline of ages provided in the Genesis text, you find an amazing mathematical Easter egg. Methuselah mathematically dies the exact year that the great floodwaters break over the earth. His incredibly long life isn't just a random piece of trivia. It seems intentionally written to signify that, as long as he lived, judgment was being delayed.
Generations later, the text zooms in on a man living in a prosperous pagan city called in modern-day Iraq. This was a bustling, ancient metropolis where people worshiped the moon god. Out of this idol-serving family, God calls Abraham and makes a foundational, radical promise. In you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Keep that exact phrase, all the families of the earth, locked in your mind. Because that specific seed of a promise is going to eventually dictate the endpoint of Luke's entire genealogy. Which brings us to Section 3, Women in the Family Tree. This brings us to what would have been the absolute most scandalous and surprising section for an ancient reader. You see, in the first century Jewish world, genealogies strictly followed male lines. Women were almost never named. Yet Matthew boldly breaks this ancient legal convention by deliberately inserting 5 specific women. Tamar was a despised widow involved in a massive family scandal. Rahab was a Canaanite prostitute living in the walls of Jericho. Ruth was a Moabite foreigner, a total outsider to Israel. The fourth isn't even named directly. She's called the wife of Uriah, which instantly brings to mind Bathsheba and King David's infamous, devastating failure and adultery. And finally, Mary. Matthew is building a legal and literary case from page 1 that the Messiah comes for the marginalized, the outsiders, and the stained. To understand how deeply this grace is woven into the text, let's zoom in on the dusty wheat fields of Bethlehem. Ruth was a destitute foreigner picking leftover grain just to survive. A wealthy man named Boaz steps into that field to protect and marry her. He acts as her Goel, a kinsman redeemer, a relative legally bound to rescue family from poverty. The text deliberately paints the scene of Boaz spreading his cloak over a helpless outsider in a wheat field as a direct anticipation of the saving work of his famous future descendant.
So the crucial point is this. If salvation depended on a flawless, pristine bloodline, this master plan would have sunk centuries ago. It's filled with idolaters, scandals, and deeply flawed individuals. It's like the authors are practically grabbing the reader by the shoulders to make them understand that this is a history written with broken people. As the quote says, the genealogy is not a list of flawless heroes, it is a list of grace.
All right, Section 4, Kings, Crowns, and Catastrophe.
Let's move forward and see how this builds into the era of the Davidic covenant. The family transitions from wandering shepherds into a grand dynasty of kings ruling from Jerusalem. This is the absolute peak of Israel's royal history. And Matthew organizes this royal history in a highly specific way, dividing it into 3 groups of exactly 14 generations. Why 14? Well, ancient Hebrew used letters as numbers, a practice called gematria. In Hebrew, David is spelled with 3 consonants. Dalet, Vav, Dalet. Dalet is 4, Vav is 6, and Dalet is 4. Add them up, and it equals exactly 14. Matthew is literally stamping the list with the numerical signature of King David. It's a literary masterstroke emphasizing that this is for sure the promised royal line. Now, to make that math work perfectly, Matthew actually skips 3 historical kings entirely. Now, to a modern reader, you might think, wait, isn't that a glaring error? Actually, scratch that. It's more like a modern subway map. Ancient genealogies weren't strict biological censuses. Just like a subway map doesn't show every physical curve of the track or every minor detail of the city above, it just highlights the stops you absolutely need to know to reach your destination. Skipping names to achieve a literary or theological structure, like emphasizing David's numerical stamp, was a completely legitimate ancient literary tool.
Following this royal map, we trace a wildly volatile timeline. We start at the absolute golden height of King David's reign. The lineage passes through good kings like Hezekiah, who faithfully defended Jerusalem against massive armies. But it also passes through terrible kings like Manasseh, who filled the temple with idols. This roller coaster of faith and failure plummets straight into the darkest chapter of their history. The beautiful temple is reduced to ash. The people face the agonizing deportation into the Babylonian exile. The crown is completely lost in catastrophe.
Next up, Section 5, The Centuries of Silence.
We now enter the post-exile era. The kingdom has fallen, the people are displaced, and the grand royal tone of the genealogy suddenly shifts dramatically. After the exile, a man named Zerubbabel helps rebuild the temple, keeping the promise alive. But after him, the names become completely unknown to history. The text strips the family of its royal titles. Imagine what it felt like to be a nobody in the royal line. For centuries, they live as mere carpenters and commoners, while massive, terrifying empires like Persia, Greece, and Rome march their armies back and forth over their homeland. They're just walking in silence, waiting for generations without a throne.
This centuries-long wait finally arrives at Joseph. For 40 generations, Matthew has used the exact same pattern, this person begot that person. But right here, he abruptly breaks the grammar. He deliberately doesn't say Joseph begot Jesus. He writes, Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born. This grammatical shift establishes a vital legal point. First-century Jewish legal code didn't view adoption as a secondary status. It was ironclad for inheritance.
Joseph gives Jesus the fully binding legal right to David's throne through adoption, perfectly securing the lineage despite not being his biological origin.
And finally, Section 6, 2 Paths to the Messiah.
And this brilliantly illustrates our central mystery, bringing it full circle. We started by asking why there are 2 completely different genealogies in the Bible that diverge after King David. With everything we've uncovered when we lay them side by side, the scholarly consensus snaps right into focus. Matthew is writing for a Jewish audience, so he starts at Abraham and traces the legal, royal line down to Joseph to explicitly prove Jesus has the legal right to the throne. Luke, however, is writing to a universal audience. He bypasses the kings, follows a biological commoner line through Mary's side, and traces it all the way back past Abraham, ending at Adam. One satisfies the Jewish legal requirements, while the other wraps its arms around the entire globe, connecting Jesus not just to Israel, but to all of humanity.
This brings us to the ultimate theological thesis of the text. The Apostle Paul famously called Jesus the last Adam. The text frames all of human history between these 2 figures. The first Adam starts in the dust of a garden, leading to the fall, the curse, and death. The last Adam finishes his work in a second garden, at an empty tomb, conquering death and bringing ultimate restoration and life. The entire genealogy, every single difficult name, is a carefully constructed bridge spanning between a broken world and its promised cosmic rescue.
From the clay of Eden to the carpenters of Nazareth, this ancient text proves that the historical master plan of grace was always intended for outsiders, the flawed and the faithful alike. Which leaves us with one final thought to ponder. If God writes the grand history of redemption using broken people, floods, devastating exiles, and centuries of painful silence, where does your name fit into this open-ended story?